Does Genesis 2:4 prove that I was wrong in my video yesterday when I said that what God told Adam would happen to him in Genesis 2:17 if he ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil didn't happen? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. And in a video I published yesterday, I pointed out that in Genesis 2:17, what God tells Adam would happen to him if he ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was that he would die on that very day. In other words, within the 24-hour period in which he ate of that fruit, he would literally and biologically die. That is what God says would certainly happen to Adam in Genesis 2:17, and it doesn't happen. And you can go check out the video I posted yesterday for the full argument. But in response, I had a bunch of people suggesting that Genesis 2:4 proves me wrong. Because in Genesis 2:4, specifically the second half of Genesis 2:4, you have this phrase, bayom, and it doesn't refer to a single 24-hour period. It refers to the day of God's creating earth and heaven, which took 6 days, and then had a seventh day of rest. Therefore, bayom can refer to more than a 24-hour period. Now, there are two critical flaws in that argument. The first is that in the video I quite explicitly and quite clearly pointed out that bayom can refer to more than a 24-hour period. However, it has to be used in conjunction with events, actions, states that are commonly understood to extend well beyond a single 24-hour period. So, for instance, if there is a reference to the day of Adonai, or if the text states in the day of your calamity, or something like that, those are things that are traditionally understood to refer to years or even generations. Therefore, you can interpret bayom to refer to something longer than a single 24-hour period. However, if bayom is used in conjunction with more chronologically narrow and precise events, you need to interpret it as a reference to a 24-hour period. So, for instance, when it says that Abraham held a feast on the day that his son Isaac was weaned, holding a feast, a child being weaned, those are very chronologically precise and narrow events. Therefore, we should understand that feast to have occurred within a single 24-hour period, not over the course of multiple years. So it depends on the events being referenced in conjunction with bayom, on the day. So I already addressed that, but that brings up the second issue. Genesis 2:4 does not use bayom in reference to an event that lasted longer than 24 hours, because Genesis 2:4 is referring precisely to the 24-hour period in which earth and heaven were created. And if you're thinking, but wait a minute, Genesis 1 says it took earth and heaven 6 days to be created, Genesis 2:4 is not referring to that creation account. Genesis 2:4b is the beginning of a separate contradictory creation account. As I've pointed out many times on my channel, there are two different and contradictory creation accounts at the beginning of Genesis. One running from Genesis 1:1 through to the first half of Genesis 2:4, and the other running from the second half of Genesis 2:4 through to the end of Genesis 3. So the bayom that is used in Genesis 2:4 is the very first word of the other creation account, which describes the earth and heaven being created on a single day. And so it's presupposing univocality to suggest that bayom in Genesis 2:4 refers to a 6 or 7 day creative period. It's a different creation account. And I think this lends support to interpreting Genesis 1:1 as a temporal clause, because it means that these two creation accounts are syntactically and grammatically parallel. The priestly account that begins in Genesis 1:1 is copying the form of the introduction of the creation account at the beginning of Genesis 2:4. Because the Genesis 2:4 creation account begins, Bayom asot Adonai Elohim eretz v'shamayim. It begins with the inseparable prefix bet, introducing a temporal clause, and then the verb is an infinitive construct, and then the subject of the verbal action follows after, and it is God, and then you have the direct object of that verbal action, which at the beginning of Genesis 2:4b is earth and heaven. When we look at Genesis 1:1, we have something syntactically parallel. However, because Genesis 1:1 is describing a 6-day creative act, the author cannot begin by talking about the day on which God created the heavens and the earth. So they have to change it. They still use the inseparable prefix bet, but instead of day, they have beginning. Bereshit, in the beginning of God, this time just Elohim rather than Adonai Elohim. And then we have the verb bara, which could be the finite verb bara, and this could still be interpreted in the construct introducing a temporal clause, but I think it's probably more likely that bara was actually intended to be an infinitive construct, baro, which is precisely what we find in the beginning of Genesis 5. So then it's followed by the subject, then it's followed by the direct object, which is significantly expanded in Genesis 1:1. It's not just Eretz v'Shamayim, it actually reverses the order, and it includes the definite article and the definite direct object marker, et ha-shamayim v'et ha'aretz. So we have syntactically, grammatically parallel ways to introduce these two different creation accounts. But the whole point is that Bayom, at the beginning of Genesis 2:4b, is not describing a multi-day creative period. It's describing the single 24-hour period on which God made earth and heaven. So no, Genesis 2:4b does not prove that my video is wrong. What it proves is that people presuppose univocality, and that is going to undermine any attempt to try to critically engage with critical scholarship regarding the Bible. An awful lot of dogmas are entangled with an awful lot of other presuppositions about the Bible, and in order to engage critical scholarship, you have to try to disentangle all of the different dogmas and presuppositions, and that takes time and that takes effort. And so appealing to Genesis 2:4b in response to the argument that what God said would happen in Genesis 2:17 to Adam didn't happen just demonstrates that folks are not there yet. Folks still have a lot of work to do to get to the point where they are thinking critically about what's going on in the Bible. And the fit for this video has been the Gotham Sirens.